So I am going to talk about this paper. And this paper is, well, it's not a paper, it's a longer case study of innovation at UNICEF from 2015 through this design and innovation fellow that did this work. This one is going to be a slightly longer video because it's a slightly longer paper. It's quite chunky. I've got a printed version that I've made notes on, and I think that as I go through the digital version here on screen, I'll be referring to some of the notes that I've highlighted in my paper version. So that's also going to make this a little bit of a longer analysis of this paper or this case study. I do think this is an interesting one, even though it is a little bit older of a paper. Well, maybe not in academic terms, but the interesting things that I called out on the front page of my written version is that at some points this case study talks about a particular tool that UNICEF maintains, rapidpro.io. Let's go have a little look at rapidpro.io to see where it is and how it exists. Yeah, so this is RapidPro. It's a open source communication platform, and it is referenced a few times during this case study, but it's actually not really talked about in any detail within this case study, which I think is interesting of itself. The paper or case study is focusing on innovation and design, and not necessarily through the lens of like openness or open source software or OSS or the tools indeed that are created or products of innovation. So this case study is more looking at innovation and design, and what I'm looking at is what does innovation mean within humanitarian organizations in terms of design, and what an openness and open source, and does innovation equal open source, and does innovative open source equal design involvement. So those are the things that I'm looking for from my own research. And I'm looking at these kinds of old papers to see what kinds of connections have been made in the past. There are some interesting things to follow up in this paper. There are references to design thinking and design inquiry from Buchanan in 2009 and 1998. There's ethnography by John Van Manen, and design as a mode of inquiry, which is the Buchanan 2001. So I've got a couple of notes of things to follow up there from a design perspective, since one of the things that I haven't read enough of. I've read a lot of open source papers and even design in open source, but I've not read enough like design related methodology or design related papers and books. So that is where I'm focusing a lot of my attention in 2022. As well as re-reviewing a lot of the papers that I've read and doing video summaries of them to help me write written summaries of them. So having a look at the abstract at first, there's a couple of things that I've noted. The first is here about key principles, practices, and processes involved in the programmatic implementation of innovation. Mandate at UNICEF, and reveals the emergent nature of no modes of generative design responsible for new configurations of social practices. So I think the most interesting thing there is that latter half. So the nature of modes of generative design responsible for new configurations of social practices, and as written in some more recent books, one that I'm reading at the moment, which is behind me, which is Ezio Manzini, talks a lot about these social practices in terms of like design, social innovation, and talks a little bit more about open source. And open source is, you know, could be described as a social practice of how you create innovative things, arguably. Just to try and find when this was published, 2015. So actually this was around about originally around about the same time as this paper. So interesting to note there. The other mediums are talking a little bit more about open source in terms of social practices and social design or social co-design, perhaps. Design for social innovation being like a social practice essentially as well. So that's the first thing that I noticed. There is also then the positive impact of key design attitude dimensions in advancing processes of organizational change and identifies a set of wins for design while pointing to the real barriers that illustrate how these design modes remain at the edge of uncharted territory. Still present, I think, in right now in 2022, design even in proprietary commercial software is still at the edge of understanding, at the edge of inclusion, but especially within, I'm looking at how true that is of humanitarian organizations, innovation, social design, and then open source as well. So there's the recognition of the place that design has within the people that are creating these kinds of tools or are part of creating these kinds of tools, essentially. To say nothing of the people using the open source for whatever use that they have for the open source, right? So in terms of Rapid Pro, like this case study, if I remember correctly, just from the general overview, talks a lot about how at UNICEF it's created, and arguably that is the focus of the case study is innovation at UNICEF. But doesn't talk much about the processes of involving the people that use the tool within the innovative processes, although I could be surprised it could just be a small section that didn't really stand out to me in my memory recall of this entire case study. The last thing that I've highlighted here is a general model of how design attitude factors are deployed within this innovation context is posited and the implications for theory and practice are offered. So yes, understanding how design attitude is understood and deployed within the innovation context is key to understanding how they could be done, or they, a way of measuring against another example in other open source software. But I do think that even though some of the tools that are being talked about within this case study, like Rapid Pro, are open source, that doesn't mean that that was part of the attitude factors for this case study. If I remember correctly, it doesn't really talk much about like open sourceness within the innovation context, but that's what I'm trying to do. So good that there's a gap, at the very least for me. Okay, so as we move into the introduction of this case study, there are a couple of things that I've highlighted. So doing different things and doing things differently that add value, around thinking outside the box and rapidly growing. And then there's some of these comments about innovation fever has broken out. They're cited from other sources, and then lots of references to innovation in non-governmental offices. And then there's a definition from another source about the term innovation. So innovation is used in this context as a mean of adaptation and improvement through finding and scaling solutions to problems in the form of products, processes, or wider business models. This is from Betts and Bloom in 2014. I think that this is really interesting statement to be taken, referenced, and cited within this case study because of the way that innovation is described. So the way that innovation described as the adaptation and improvement through finding and scaling solutions to problems in the form of products, sounds a lot like how often open source projects operate, right? So open source projects often are created to solve a particular problem that a particular person is having, or a particular group of people, depending on how the origin story of open source tools come about. But there is this process of adaptation and improvement through finding problems, or finding bugs, or finding, coming to solutions of problems and then contributing back to the open source product. So by using this definition, by looking at the behavior of existing open source that I know of, that I've experienced, just anecdotally, the projects that I've been involved in, you could apply the term innovation to the practices that open source does, which might not really be surprising to many, but it's good to see. But yeah, the interesting thing is that this goes on to talk about innovation in initiatives to promote new modes of experimentation, open source collaboration being one of them, and then going on to some other examples. So really explicitly calling out in the introduction there, open source collaboration as a innovation new mode of experimentation. So, you know, there's a direct link there within this case study to open source collaboration as innovation experiment. There then is a comment about design-based practices oriented towards collective and social ends, in which designers increasingly act as mediators and knowledge brokers between different fields of expertise. This is gaining recognition and traction from from these authors here, Armstrong, Bailey, Julier, and Kimball from 2014, just to kind of make sure I make a note of that. But the interesting thing is here is that this is actually often in practice through my own, again, anecdotal observations of designers within open source. This is the role that they often play and talk about playing, is this broker between the different functions or the different people within open source, and brokering that knowledge and understanding things better. One immediate example that I can think of is a recent conversation from a podcast that I participate in called the SOS Design Podcast, the Sustaining Open Source Design Podcast, where we talk to the product managers, designers of I2P. So I2P is a private peer-to-peer, I believe, network tool, I2P.net, anonymous network tool. And they really talked about the critical role that design played within improving a really complex tool or a really complex process, which is the Invisible Internet project, where to better understand how to design this tool better for people that aren't necessarily some of the people that could understand the code immediately. It was really about being that knowledge broker between the people that do understand the inner workings of how this functions from almost like a code perspective, translating that into real, like, tangible improvements to the usability. So here there's an example, a real kind of life example, as it were, of recent time. So there's lots of detail then about, like, UNICEF's definition. Really, the next bits that are highlighted for me is this how design capabilities and design principles are articulated as part of the innovation agenda of UNICEF and manifest within the organization. This is interesting to me as well. To me, particularly interested in design capabilities, design principles articulated as part of the innovation agenda within UNICEF, but in direct relation to open source software. So what really I'm looking for is this statement, but specifically in relation to the open source software that any organization, humanitarian or human rights organization here, UNICEF has in relation to the open source software that they are maintaining, building, innovating on, however. There's a little bit here which is interesting about how can we relate to the manifestation of salient design attitude, dimensions, and practices to the process of innovation underway at the organizational level. And I think that this is an interesting piece to call out, because often within open source software, as well as innovation work, things are already underway. There's already something in existence before design is introduced or involved, or however you want to describe design involvement as part of innovation. So I think that for me, this section speaks to the entry points, the consistent entry points, the consistent existence of design, and how that relates to innovation. Again, I can't quite recall whether there's actually like specifics about that and that relationship, but certainly interesting to pay attention to on a second read through as to whether that that presents itself. There's then several pages then of talking about some of the methods and processes that will be used in this case study, some of the things that they've noticed already. So like about levels of high design fluency practicing by managers and designers within there. Some talk about like the ethnographic approach to this work. So a lot of what this person did in this case study is from working at UNICEF on these innovation projects. They sort of wove in their research into sort of like this ethnographic process of paying attention to conversations, not only in the I am practicing and doing a job role within this organization or doing some work within this organization, but also in paying attention to the context of the conversation in terms of the things that I'm researching. So that's a interesting thing to make sure that we keep in mind when we're reading through some of this data and so this case study. There is further on to page 10, detail about how they are examining design attitude manifestations and identify sets of wins for design's collective agency within the organization. I mean, interesting in and of itself, but again, I'm mostly interested in design agency within the open source tool context within innovation. So, and if I remember correctly, there isn't a lot of that there. There's then lots of detail into the theoretical background of design inquiry and design attitude. I think that a lot of this is not deeply relevant for this video. It is interesting as an approach to what they're looking to. For me, more than anything, highlighted a lot of things that I might want to bring into the case studies that I end up doing for this project. I think the one thing that I want to pull out here on page 11 is designing as a mode of inquiry rather than a distinct professional or technical competency. So this is interesting when we think back to the example of ITP that I gave. So design is not just about a output, as it were, or a technical competency or as kind of design that you practice, but as a mode of inquiry, as the individual / entity labeled as designer, asking the questions that help define the problems. So I think that that's interesting when you think of it in the context of what roles designers play and what things designers do within open source currently. And I have noticed, again, going back to the ITP example, that it's a mediating role. This then goes on page 12 to talk about the design's capacity as a mediating discipline and about facilitating creative processes that contribute new meaning, which could indeed be how design manifests within open source software tools for humanitarian organizations and human rights organizations. That could be the key finding, that is what design means and does within this space. I think there are a lot of tensions and challenges within open source as to whether that is valuable, but that kind of goes into other reading and different reading within the open source and design space, not necessarily the innovation, design, humanitarian space. Yeah, there's a lot of conversation just about the skills that designers bring, or the processes and capabilities that designers bring in the next few pages. Stuff like, I'll scroll through them quickly, but things like designers' heuristics around then going into things like ambiguity tolerance, creativity, aesthetics, empathy, and connecting multiple perspectives. Understanding institutional logics and working with those within design, connecting multiple perspectives, and oh, I've said that one already, but it's repeated again. So yeah, it goes on to detail the kinds of, I believe, the kinds of things that designers contribute when we, or the kinds of things that designers do when we talk about design being a like mode of inquiry versus like a professional technical competency. So interesting when you look at it in that way. Going past into the section which is just about, there's a section about organizational culture and emergence practice, which is interesting. There on page 16, there is a section about change initiatives diverge sometimes from the vested interests and norms of the dominant organizational culture of UNICEF. Does that mean that innovation introduces through design or open source or both different ways of practicing what is done that kind of go against the grain of this dominant culture? And I remember later in the case study, it talks a lot about how, a little bit more generally about how software is created, which if we're interpreting software is in the Rapid Pro open source software, then we can assume that any references, or we can with some confidence assume that any references to software practices could apply to the open source software tool that they have mentioned once already, which is Rapid Pro. We could say that, you know, some of those practices are going against what is dominant culture within this organization. And if I remember correctly, it talks about kind of some of the standard things that happen in software, like sprints and, you know, agile improvements and like less kind of top-down waterfall, define everything that you want, and more responsive to the field activities of what UNICEF is trying to solve. If I remember correctly, it does go into some detail about shelter, so physical product, I think. Possibly could be mixing it up with something else I've read though. So on page 18, what have we got here? An interesting sort of observation to always pay attention to when you look at an organization culture, or an organization that has a culture, which is creed. How can individual actors change the institutions if their actions, intentions, and rationality are all conditioned to a certain degree by the very institution they wish to change? So I think that this is something interesting when you think about open source more broadly and designers' involvement, but also humanitarian and human rights organizations. Maybe connected to something like length of service or potential for this conditioning that can happen. I've certainly seen it happen to myself and other folks, where you are conditioned by the processes that are dominant within open source culture in order to, there's a lot of, there's other readings and other papers that talk about how UX culture and design culture doesn't necessarily fit into the open source culture box that currently exists in order to receive contributions or receive designers as an entity in any way. So therefore, does UX culture need to fit open source culture mold more to be able to participate, or does open source culture need to fit the UX mold and be broken in ways in order to receive UX culture? So to that extent, I am interested in this kind of conditioning from both a organizational UNICEF perspective within this case study, but also from a general open source, how does this play out in an open source cultural space? Because within my research, looking at designers specifically within humanitarian and human rights open source software, you're not only working with and playing in the space of organizational or institutional conditioning, but you're also working with and trying to pay attention to the open source culture conditioning, if at all. So that's interesting. Again, lots of really detailed information about like UNICEF's staff makeup, organizational sort of structures, and then about how they're gathering data, the kinds of things that they're gathering, and how they're tracking development, design, and deployment of stuff. So let's go to page 24, actually, because this is where they talk about Rapid Pro a little bit more, and I have highlighted some sections, but not in detail. So let's reread this. So this researcher was invited to track the unfolding of the conceptual development, design, and deployment of the Innovation Unit's flagship innovation project at the time of the study, the Rapid Pro open source software platform for international development, referred to by my innovation team as an app store for development tools. These are quite common, I think, these open source platforms or tools that collect series of other tools that are useful. It's kind of like I guess a mini operating system, I don't know, or like we'll see. But it's about that curation process of tools that could be used. Makes a lot of sense in field work within like UNICEF's work, like going out into spaces where you might not have access to or know what tool to use. So if you have like a package of tools, makes a lot of sense, innovative in and of itself. Like imagine you're doing a humanitarian process that you've never done before and you don't know what the right tool for that is, and imagine that this Rapid Pro tool has a tool that you could investigate or look at to be able to perform that function. Makes sense. Interesting that it's innovation within this context. I feel like the open source space has been doing this in some ways for quite a long time. So maybe the innovation process is more UNICEF learning from open source and doing this for themselves. Cool. They talk about Rapid Pro and what it does for a little bit, and then innovation. And then they talk a little bit more about like methods of collection and things like that for the data, and the structured interview studies and things like that, and how they will write about it, etc. Data collection stage and all the different things that they've collected. And then we're into the findings section from page 32 onwards. So there's quite a lot of sections where I don't have notes on things. I think that doesn't necessarily mean it's not interesting. I think it just means that I didn't notice particular things related to open source, maybe. But we do have some notes on page 34. Here, there's a quote that I've, part of a quote, when you have that leadership from the top that takes that tone, it has two main reactions. There's a group of staff who will push back, may not be vocally or physically, just a lack of cooperation, making things take a long time to be responded to. So this mostly just pointed out antagonistic dynamics. I think it's possible that the reason that I highlighted this is because of the instances that I've observed similar behavior in open source to design. And I believe that this is in reference to the attention that the innovation unit was getting from certain members of staff at UNICEF and their ability to do things certain ways, and that innovative approach to the work that they were doing was causing some antagonistic behaviors from other folks across the organization. So a little bit different to the antagonistic stuff that can happen in open source, but still. There's an interesting section on diversity and inclusion and demographics of people. I mostly just take note because it does come up in anything to do with design and open source, that designers as a function are a minority within the space. And that in and of itself is a diversity inclusion failing, but from a function point of view, not necessarily diversity when we talk about demographics of people particularly, although that does come into play a lot with inclusion of different functions. I mean, that's a whole other thesis, to be honest, about the diversity demographic makeup of non-code contributions. Interesting in and of itself, but not particularly what I'm looking at, but might be an interesting finding that I deep dive into. Yep, okay, so if we continue. Okay, so I've got a section here where I've on page 40. So there is this quote here in relation to agility, for the expectations of the innovation unit for how design has to perform, one of the designers within the visual strategy team of UNICEF, so not within the innovation unit, I believe, or the wider design team, has a quote here. We practice agility with our communication methods. One minute we need to create work that speaks to Executive Director or the UN Secretary General, but in the next minute we are preparing to display work for private funders. We toggle between print, digital, practice designing with constraint. If the internet is slow in a country, how do we still disseminate information that is accessible? If Adobe Creative Suite is not practical, then how can we maximize Microsoft Office? Google isn't available, then what's the next best way of sharing work documents? We grow and progress without letting too little or too many choices slow us down. How can we continue to create strong design work under the pressure of time? I think the note that I put next to this is open source software design, question mark. Not necessarily in terms of the specific tools or processes that, or people that have been referenced in this quote, but more working within the constraints, and how in my experience open source design is similar in that you work within the constraints of the open source software culture, or not, or you try and change the culture, or you try and change the practices in order to fit the way that you need to do design more. I do think this last part with the how do we continue to create strong design work under the pressure of time is something that's present within open source. The pressure of time is both open and closed. So open in terms of you have infinite time to contribute to some things, and like time and also no time to contribute. So the best time to contribute is now, and the next best time to contribute is whenever, not now, at any time other than now. Basically, there's because of this, because of a lot of the open source projects having either weak roadmaps or no roadmaps, or no sort of progress of how things will happen. There exists both the state of immense time pressure to do something with something, and also no time pressure. So it exists in two simultaneous states for designers, often, probably developers as well. Can't speak to that experience as much. There is then a quote just from a co-lead coachy person saying, I think design really helps in terms of communication, about trying to make our team much better at articulating what it wants to communicate in an upbeat and engaging way. So this is more talking about design in relation to innovation, not really open source, but I get the assumption that I'm making is that because the framing is with this open source tool, Rapid Pro, that these design insights into the innovation process apply to the innovation process of that open source software tool. So while this is talking about how design has made communication better, articulating what they want to communicate in whatever way, applied to the innovation process within UNICEF, because this is being applied to Rapid Pro. That is also true of their open source processes. There's then some interesting comments about how they've been categorized within the innovation space. Crazy and innovative young people running around trying to make a bunch of innovations in this kind of new and kooky way through open practices maybe is inherent within that statement. I would be interested to know what that, how much of that is in relation to the openness side of open source, or the open sourciness, or just about innovation practices, irregardless. There's then a lot of conversations about how innovation in humanitarian spaces is yesterday kind of new, and like the timelines and timescales that humanitarian organizations work to. There's then some really interesting section a little bit further down. So here is where I think there is a direct relation to design within open source and expressed as design within a humanitarian organization working on open source. So the desire to make the argument for innovation and design to become visible and concrete is, of course, closely associated with the importance of having legitimacy as part of the institutional logics of the organization, which emphasize urgency and accountability at scale. One of the informants from the innovation unit expressed the importance of this concern in terms of justifying decision-making and action. Then it goes on about quite like concrete outcomes and things like that. I think the reason that I highlight this is in the under the lens of open source legitimacy. I mean, as part of the institutional logics of the organization, which is what's being observed here, but I argue that legitimacy of design as part of the institutional logics of open source more broadly is often what surfaces in other open source projects or other open source communities. But interesting that there's this comparative vector for humanitarian open source, which is legitimacy within the institutional logics of the organization. But then how does the legitimacy in terms of open sourceness play in for designers? And then urgency and accountability at scale. Yeah, this is just tricky for designers and open source to work with. Okay, where are we going to? We are then following actually on from this kind of concreteness. We move into page 47. We've got principles section here, so the confluence of innovation and design, and we've got some principles about designing with the user. Principle 1, design with the user. Beginning points and guides to conduct that should be followed, like the work follows these principles. So these are actually super important within the innovation in humanitarian space, and also to look at them from like an open source perspective. So if principle 1 is design with the user, you know, that is difficult within an open source space unless you invite the users into the open source space, the users of Rapid Pro, or facilitate or have some co-design process. I don't know. The barriers for users to enter into the open sourceness of something is still something that I have not read much about, and I only have my like own anecdotal insights in practicing. And then we've got like be collaborative, which is interesting. It's hard to be collaborative as a designer in open source. In this, under the same terms as developers, I think that's the main thing. It's like under the constraints of that are there for developers. There's also a lot of this talk about concrete. So we've heard concrete before, and I think that sometimes, and it feels like it's in direct conflict with something that was said earlier, which is like design as a mode of inquiry, or asking questions essentially versus outputs. So there's this tension between concreteness in design for innovation and open source kind of software tools, and then the value of design as a facilitative, communication improving inquiry value. And there just doesn't seem to be a method for the inquiry, you know, for that to be captured as concrete, or to be worded as concrete, or to be valued. So really is one of the key things here about understanding how things designed within open source can be made more concrete within humanitarian software. There's then some sections here that I've highlighted. So design as a broad central organizational capacity, which, I mean, that's a whole can of worms to talk about in relation to open source, other kinds of open source, right? Like other kinds of open source doesn't necessarily, outside of a humanitarian or human rights ownership context or custodian context, how can you have a central design capacity for an open source software project or tool if it is not organizational, institutionalized, which many are. There's then some discussion after that centralized organized capacity about creative approach to problem solving, which both designers and non-professionally trained designers in the organization might carry out in a systematic manner. So this is interesting, that people are involved in the design process. They should be co-design, like participatory action research, all this kind of stuff, and collaboration that we noticed earlier. So it makes a lot of sense. On page 49, I underlined and highlighted just a section which I probably just found amusing, which is to change the design from A to B, it takes money, time, and effort. Often open source doesn't have money. Sometimes there is undefined amounts of time, and sometimes there are undefined amounts of effort. This makes this even more difficult process to do. It then goes on to talk about how the pluralism of these meanings leaves design position in the organization ambiguous place, which is also true of design within open source. It's a very ambiguous place. So within this paper, there's a lot of really interesting sort of data collected in these tables. I highlighted, of all the kind of things that I've highlighted, the one that I paid attention to was this ability to embrace discontinuity and failure, which open source often does. It often discontinues, fails, or the maintenance effort is non-linear, non-forward progressing. Sometimes it stagnates and stays still. Sometimes it, different things happen here. Within design, that means a lot of different things, but these are categorized as the wins for design attitude manifestations. So we've got ambiguity tolerance, which was talked about in the introduction, just about being something that design does well. And then it's the ability to embrace that. We've got then some quotes, a lot of time spent preparing for things that do not exist, the ability to be agile, flexible, critical success for the factor for the future. Success comes from taking risks and we push those words a lot, that vernacular. So just some interesting statements about the ability for design to tolerate ambiguity, which exists in abundance in open source. Again, that's my own opinion. I then highlighted this translator effort from the empathy, how design is important to innovation, because it's a kind of translator between the people, program officers or users, depending on what an institution does with users and how close program officers are to user. In my own experience, program officers are often we're very close to users, directly working with them and doing some design activities with them, and then developers and communicating the needs. So we're almost there, I think. Gosh, this is such a good case study. At this point, what I think I might do is pause and record a second part to this. The last thing that I want to do is just maybe cover a few of these other things, just about creativity. Without creativity, none of it works without creativity, even if it's not the only driver for innovation. And then some value, not as people who can just make pretty things into visual design. So this is about design not just being visual design, but also that creativity, going back to something I said a little bit earlier, is how do you collect creativity within an open source context? Like, how is that able to be contributed in the methods, in the real collection, the spaces that open source operates, right? They don't really exist, but if innovation won't work without creativity, how can open source support it? There's then some really interesting stuff about invisibility of design. Invisibility is obviously, and when you look at the two words, invisibility and openness, like even if it's in the open, if it's invisible, you still can't see it. So this speaks to the invisibility of design. So even if it's open, how it's invisible. There's a statement then about get the design team away from just becoming a team that's creating UI and more about strategic thinking. So there's so many different opinions about what design does in even organizations that explicitly request design, that part of me thinks that how could open source, even if it explicitly requests design involvement or explicitly makes space for design involvement, how can it begin to tackle something like understanding that design can be more than churning out UI? How can it afford that time to request that or receive that or understand that, even if, you know, in a funded space it's tricky. There's then some statements about not really understanding the value of design as much. This one's really interesting. Lead designer of the innovation unit, they don't really understand the value of design as much because they are not exposed to it. So exposure, interesting, especially within the connection to openness and visibility, which is hard. They're kind of doing things similarly, but then a lot of times they're skipping the design part of the designer. They just go to the developer who can build the functionality, but he will not always have a sense of the actual people using the technology. So this speaks to that, you know, facilitator piece, that inquiry piece, that strategical thinking piece, but it's wrapped up in all of these things like invisibility and lack of value, and the team just becoming like UI churners and things like that. It's like, and within open source, you often already have a developer who has built some functionality in relation to their needs, like the scratching your own itch reason for building open source software. So I think this speaks a lot to some of those tensions within open source a little bit more widely. At this point, I'm going to stop this recording, start a new one, and start from page 55 onwards and finish this review of this case study a little bit later. Okay, I am continuing. covering the paper from the case study from the UNICEF, the Innovation by Design at UNICEF. So where I got up to is page number 55 is the next section that I have notes on. So here we have a table of data, design, attitude, limitations. The section that I have highlighted here is that sometimes some of the design language can sound very pretentious. We've got the word pretentious here. And then we've also got a statement about alienating people. And then we have a statement which is, as the lead manager, I'm trying to develop a culture of how design is important for UNICEF, how it is impactful. And we can think about these in context to the open source software Rapid Pro, that this whole case study around innovation and design is part of that, is within the team that is looking at Rapid Pro. And then the last thing that I have highlighted here is it does take a bit to orient them, professional designers, to kind of switch their minds before they can do the task that is given to them, lead design. Presumably, I would be interested to know what actually that relates to, because I am reading it with an open source lens, in the sense that it does take a bit to orient them, professional designers, to an open source kind of process and tool and way of doing things, and kind of switch their minds before they can do the task that is given to them. So I am looking at it from a very specific perspective, in that I have an open source lens. The other things that I highlighted around pretentious, alienating people, and how a culture of design is important for UNICEF is just words that I think are interesting to think of when we think of how design is viewed in open source. Like, it can be read as very pretentious, and it can alienate a lot of people, but it is then still important for how things become innovative, at least from UNICEF's example. We then have a section around accountability on the next page, where the theme of accountability was inherently connected to discussions about innovation and the implications of risk-taking in a complex and fast-changing world environment. That speaks to the humanitarianism aspect of this. Let's just pause for a moment. So we are looking at the section that says accountability connected to discussions about innovation, the fast-changing world environment. That's in relation to the humanitarian aspects of fast-changing world environment. But accountability is something that comes up in open source quite a lot. Like, who is accountable for what part of open source? Are you only accountable for the PR? What is, like, that tends to come up in governance conversations, and designers aren't often considered as part of governance conversations, or if they are, only in very light terms, I suppose. Anyway, in my experience. There was also this comment about protecting the organizational brand and identity, which is interesting. This made me think of the example of Mozilla's open design work, where a lot of what they did around their rebranding and open design effort was because, or not because solely, but driven by how the Mozilla, different people creating Mozilla applications or plugins or different things in the Mozilla ecosystem meant that, like, they created their own interpretation of the brand and stuff. And it turned out that a lot of the plugins and applications tend to use bits of the branding and identity, but not correctly. So it got absorbed within the wider open design process to kind of standardize those kinds of things. If standardization is a good word to use, maybe it's not. On the next page, on 57, there is some comments about failing fast. In typical innovations situations and how it's a luxury, and kind of a little bit about monitoring and evaluation within humanitarian and human rights. And like that is how they measure success. So when we look at like innovative solutions or innovation in terms of how design is involved and whether innovation and design is connected to an open source tool or software, that you can't remove the want for humanitarian and human rights organizations to have impact report metrics, monitoring and evaluation results, like ways of being able to communicate the reporting on their work. And I think that this is an interesting specific thing to humanitarian and human rights work. So like the idea of building within an open source and designing within an open source community and environment is not necessarily is difficult, or is, you know, you have to have conversations about things like monitoring and evaluation. To be able to have a conversation about like the sort of successfulness of the innovation open source needs to be linked to how they measure success in a way. And there's then a comment about the word legitimacy. Around the theme of urgency as it relates to innovation. So legitimacy, and then they go on to say things like about showing results. Again, we've got this same word concretely and demonstrating things concretely, which again, as we've said multiple times, doesn't necessarily work in good partnership with this design inquiry role that is valued anecdotally from the data in this case study. People have their quotes about it being valued, but that it is hard to demonstrate that concretely. There's a statement that's kind of an aspirational statement, it sort of sounds like, but there's this statement around we have to be doing it differently, we have to do it better, faster, easier, safer, to be more effective and require change. And this speaks to the innovation kind of principles. I wonder if it also speaks to open source, but it's also a note that I put, which is open source faster, easier, safer, better, more effective? Like, I think that's a big question. I think the assumption that it is an error in judgment necessarily. There's not evidence that it necessarily is these things. There's not any evidence that these not these things, or there is some evidence that it's not those things, but there's, you know, not as much on either side. There's not enough understanding. There's some conversations with some comments about how innovation is a catalytic, plays a unique catalytic role in enhancing performance and things like that. And then some comments about wanting to go faster, which is, you know, interesting within an open source software. Understanding because faster is relative to a lot of things in the open source. There's a comment down here where I've got, this isn't a place where you have the luxury to do a ton of processes work, which is particularly interesting. I've got a note next to it, which is hard to reconcile that statement within the wider context of my experience within open source as a designer. in the open source often requires, depending on scale or just depending on like different parameters, processes in order to make it work. Like it is built on a contributions system, all these kinds of other things. You need processes work to be effective in order to build and design and develop effective open source that solves problems. The next notes that I have are on page 64, where I have towards the bottom here, unity, where are we looking? Ambiguity, so examinations of the design attitude dimensions identified in the literature, 3 key dimensions that I suspected would be particularly significant in accounting for innovation processes: ambiguity, tolerance, connecting multiple perspectives, and empathy would perform in the organizational context of the US. The data confirmed the proposition. We've got now a comment about creativity and aesthetics were more polarizing in the organizational context, and had a tendency to be often at the source of tensions. So this is interesting, given that one conversation that I've been having recently, or a thought that I've been having recently in some of my wider reading, is how code is either correct and functions, or is not correct and does not function. So there's either working code, no matter what you code it in, language-wise, or however, you know, there's correct working code that solves a problem, and there is broken, not working code that does not solve the problem. Whereas with design, it doesn't equate to that method. Like there is not working design that is functions, like, and there is not broken design that is an error. There are degrees of how effective or specific design works for a variety of different users, people, cases, contexts. There is no, to potentially use a phrase sort of incorrectly, but there's no zero-sum way of regarding design in the same way as correct code or incorrect code. On page 67, we have we've got a statement which is gaining perspectives on the interdependencies related to design attitude. And interdependencies is always an interesting word to pay attention to within open source. I wonder what are the dependencies related to design attitude manifestations in the organization in relation to the open source work. You know, design dependencies is not talked about, I suppose. Like design dependencies would be an interesting investigation probing topic. We've then got a section which is about developing the Rapid Pro project, remember, open source, and managing its successful deployment during a moment of crisis amidst the Ebola epidemic of the Rapid Pro, is a case of this. So we've got mechanisms at the macro level of the organization show how design attitude can be transformational when it occurs at the micro level and impacts the macro level. So here we're talking about the successful deployment of the open source Rapid Pro project during the Ebola epidemic. I find this confusing, given I can't see the evidence of what the design involvement was within this transformational design attitudes impacts. I find it difficult to pick out from the rest of the case study what this actually entailed, or you know, how it was expressed. It's still quite confusing. I would want to know, I would want to see what like proposed from this case study creator, just like a proposed pathway of different design interventions, attitudes, or anything that they think contributed to that successful deployment. Like, I think that I need to see the suggestions of how that looked from a design perspective. As we sort of go into the closing parts of the conclusion here, there are no other things that I've really noted as far as like paying attention to what I'm looking for around the open source and design and innovation and the humanitarian aspects. The writer does talk about some limitations. Around innovation practices and design, and the findings may be generalizable. There is a kind of lack of clear, for me, clear correlation, comparison, or just understanding of what the open source side of things are here. But then again, like I said at the beginning, the case study doesn't, seek to speak to the open source in more than it was the innovation project to observe design within at UNICEF. So understandable that it's not there, but also a little disappointing. So I think all in all, the thing that is missing for me within this piece of work is looking at the data or going back to the same team and asking them questions about the specifically related to the open source. The open sourceness of the project and whether that affects or changes or informs further kind of data collection through discussion with them, potentially worthwhile investigating, but we'll see. For now, thank you very much for listening.